You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by architecture writer and journalist Alexandra Lange to talk about her book, Meet Me by the Fountain, An Inside History of the Mall. We chat about the evolution of the mall, equity and legal implications, and of course, pop culture. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks for supporting each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of zoning nerds and infrastructure wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. The lightweight bike-only scarves have arrived, so you can choose between those or our bus-only scarves when signing up on Patreon. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also now pre-order our winter heavy knit bus or bike-only scarves at theoverheadwire.com or order one of the lightweight summer bike-only scarves for immediate delivery. Order now at theoverheadwire.com. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Alexandra Lange, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I'm an architecture and design critic, and I just wrote a book called Meet Me by the Fountain, An Inside History of the Mall. And my previous book, which I feel like might come up as we talk, was The Design of Childhood, How the Material World Shapes Independent Kids. So basically, I'm interested in the kind of popular architecture that everyone experiences, but may not realize has a long intellectual and cultural history.
When was your first experience with architecture? Like, what was your first inclination that this was something that was of interest to you?
Well, I guess the origin story that I usually tell is that in 8th grade, I took a class at the Durham Arts Council in architecture with somebody who was a professor at the North Carolina State College of Design. And the first day he gave us each an architectural plan, a plan of a house, and said, can you extrapolate from this plan what the house looks like? And everyone else in the class got a fairly normal house plan, but I got a plan that just looked like a bunch of dots with very thin lines between them. And then I could tell where there was a front door, but I took it back to the teacher and said, where are the walls? And he said, what if there aren't any walls? And it turned out it was the plan of Philip Johnson's glass house. So in fact, there weren't any walls.
It was all glass.
It was all glass. So that was, I think, a really important introduction to modern architecture and kind of like how far you can take it. And after that, I was interested in being an architect and writing about architecture and kind of went back between those two things for quite a while.
Did you know after that you were going to go be a critic and, extrapolate that even further?
I actually wanted to be an architect myself for a long time. I specifically applied to a number of colleges that had architecture programs, and I was an architecture major as an undergraduate at Yale, but I also started being a writer and then an editor for the Yale Daily News, the college paper at that time. So I feel like I was kind of double tracking writing and designing for a long time. And ultimately, I decided that I was a better writer than I was a designer.
Oh, I wish I was a better writer and designer. So you have written a book about the mall, Meet Me by the Fountain. What brings you to write a book about malls?
Well, I grew up with malls. I grew up in Durham, North Carolina. And so I had a lot of really formative experiences, and that was where I went as a teenager to go to the movies. That was where I shopped. They were kind of a big deal in my area, and there weren't a lot of other places to hang out. So I had that personal background, but then I got more interested in the topic circa 2018 when I read that the architect Renzo Piano was designing a mall called City Center Bishop Branch in the Greater Bay Area. And there was all this incredulity about such a famous architect designing a mall. And I was like, wait a second, I seem to recall that lots of famous architects design malls, and he didn't really want to call it a mall because that was somehow déclassé. And I was like, but what's wrong with a mall? I remember malls being really fun, and I think that, malls provide an important pedestrian environment in the suburbs and all the rest of it. So I started writing pieces that were basically like staking a claim for both the importance of the mall and the goodness of the mall at a time when I think a lot of people were ready to treat that project as kind of a joke.
There's a lot of critiques of malls by the urban set, I guess. Why is that?
Well, I mean, malls are a symbol of the suburbs, and there is a certain amount of knee-jerk critique of the suburbs in a lot of urban conversations. And I guess I want to make sure people know that I'm not 100% a mall advocate. I think one of the things that I try to make clear in the book is that there are a lot of ironies and ambivalences around the story of the mall, but I think it's important to take them seriously. And that's kind of like the animating force of my book. So, I mean, why do people scoff at malls? I mean, they're capitalist, they're commercial, they are often, kind of populated by women and children. They are definitely suburban. And in a lot of cases, they've fallen on hard times. So all of these things make them not quite the bright, shiny, aspirational object that they used to be.
They are also a land bank to a certain extent for the future. It's interesting to think about them that way as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I discovered as I went along doing the research of the book was just I sort of grappled with just how much square footage malls encompass, both in terms of their big empty parking lots and also, under the roofed sections of malls. It's just a tremendous amount of architectural and spatial material. And since some malls are dying, and those malls are more likely to be the first and second ring suburban malls that were built in the 60s and 70s and haven't kept up with the times, those also tend to be the suburbs that are more dense and more diverse than they used to be. So now you have these dense, diverse places with a dead mall in the center of them. And those dead malls seem like a perfect opportunity to do something new that better reflects what those suburbs are today and what the needs of people living there today are.
Yeah, it's just interesting to think about the evolution of the mall from where it started and where it is now in terms of the high-end level, but also the kind of the moderate and low-end levels in terms of the types of shoppers they're trying to attract and what that means for the future of urban design and cities generally.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things is that sometimes people think, oh, this mall is going downhill because it has local shops rather than big national chains. But in a lot of places, that's actually a much better business model. People are much more interested in buying locally. Those local entrepreneurs may have closer ties to different parts of the community, immigrant communities. And so they're fulfilling a need that, another branch of Forever 21 is never going to fulfill.
Well, that's true. And it goes kind of full circle, too. I mean, Victor Greun and Elsie Krumik wanted post office, doctor's offices, libraries as part of the mall. And, now big box stores who are trying to reinvent themselves are kind of lucky if they get those things, in the former buildings of malls.
Yeah, after one of my early stories, related to the book came out, I got contacted by the Anne Arundel Library, which has quite a large branch in a Westfield mall in Maryland. And they started out as just a little pocket branch because the mall didn't have a bookstore and was interested in, having some kind of book presence in the mall. And that branch did so well that now they have, I think it's like a 50,000 square foot store, like quite a big presence. And they stock it all with fairly recent books. And they do a lot of programming there because people will just, walk in and go to an author event. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Greun and other early mall designers envisioned, that kind of authentic and actually public community experience happening in the mall. And so now in a time of need, people are remixing them to include those things, but that was always in the original concept.
One of my favorite things about the book is kind of taking a trip down memory lane in terms of like the pop culture and thinking about all the movies that we saw with malls and kids and those types of things. I'm wondering what the impression of malls was from pop culture. You know, we have Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Mallrats, high school movie classics from the 80s and 90s. Do you have a favorite movie related to the mall as well?
My favorite is Clueless, actually, which I feel like is a kind of high mall movie. And the scene I always talk about is when Cher and Christian are shopping together. She doesn't know he's gay yet, but he is basically her new gay best friend and shopping buddy. And both of them are looking very beautiful, very glossy, and they're coming up the escalator under this big glass roof of the mall in Westwood. And it's just kind of this, the architect frames them perfectly. And like, that's the kind of promenade experience that the designers of the mall intended everyone to have. And I feel like the movie is really using the mall architecture to underline this kind of moment of peak beauty for these two, which is also the pride goeth before a fall moment, because, you know, Clueless is based on Emma and Emma has to learn her lesson.
Yeah, yeah. I think my favorite is Mallrats. And I think it's partially because, and I was thinking about this through the book, is that, you know, in the middle, they get kicked out of the mall and they have to go to another mall and it's a lower rent mall. And so you see this kind of evolution of malls even back then to a certain extent. They had to go to what they called, quote unquote, the dirt mall, which is really fascinating, kind of thinking about how even then there was like, you know, kind of step ups and step downs in terms of this mall culture.
And that's also a great example of the ambivalence that I referred to earlier. I mean, teens love the mall. Teens were identified with malls. We see that reflected in pop culture, but teens are also perpetually being kicked out of malls.
Yeah, you mentioned that too, is kind of this space for teens and where they stuck certain stores and the arcades, right? Like where they wanted teens to be versus where teens wanted to be.
Exactly, right? I mean, the arcade was a perfect thing to put in one of those hallways that's not really prime real estate because it doesn't need, you know, street frontage. It doesn't need glass windows. In fact, arcades are better when they're kind of dark and windowless and have a little bit of a, you know, raffish aura. And I don't know, I can't remember in Mallrats where the comic book store is located, but that's also the kind of thing that might go for the lower rent storefront that is in one of the hallways before you get to the big shiny top lit part of the mall.
You also take us through a history of the US version of the mall and some international history as well for inspiration, but it seems like it's driven a lot by personalities. I mean, you have Jurdy, you have Victor Greun, Caesar Pelli. What did you take from the human factor behind mall evolution?
Well, I think a lot of the great, you know, kind of mall makers who were both, some of them were designers and some of them were developers, thought of themselves as salesmen. And this was definitely true for Greun. Like he had to convince all of these American investors and civic leaders that the mall was the wave of the future. And when he first started doing that, he was a fairly recent Viennese immigrant. You know, he was Jewish, he was rebuilding his career in the US. And he did that by very savvily combining really great visuals with a lot of business knowledge. His partner, Larry Smith, put together extensive books, kind of convincing civic leaders that they would make more money if they moved to the suburbs and were part of a mall. So I think that the mall as commercial architecture and as akin to some of the commercial products sold in the mall is a really important part of the narrative, and that these people that were really successful in that business had to be that kind of salesperson. You know, at the time they wouldn't have been on TV, so you wouldn't say telegenic, but I think they were what we would today call telegenic people.
It's interesting, in the end of the book, you talk about a little bit about the transit-oriented mall in a lot of international settings. And I didn't even know that Jurdy was a mall designer because my introduction to him was through transit-oriented developments. Like you'd go on and you'd type in transit-oriented development in Google and you'd find these fantastical designs for Asian cities and other places. And they were all, you know, Jurdy designs. And so I didn't even know he was a mall guy per se, right, until I actually read your book, which is really fascinating because I came to him from a different angle.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that that's what popped up if you search him now, because I always kind of knew about him as the designer of the Mall of America. And writing this book made me, you know, appreciate his work and kind of his vision and the like lengths to which he would go to make the mall into an entertainment space even more. But it makes sense that especially as more of his business was in Asia, where malls tend to be over, subways and other transit, that his design efforts would kind of sprawl out from a retail center to include the kind of, housing and offices and everything that really malls in the US should also have. That is definitely a direction that we should go in with our dead malls, or even just malls that could support more dense residential development around them.
Yeah, definitely recommend Googling Jerde, Jerde, and TOD, or Transit-Oriented Development. It's some of his designs are really cool, and I was always inspired, like, oh, that'd be really cool to have somewhere in the United States, but it was always in Asia.
There's one in Japan, now I can't remember what city, that basically has a lazy river going through it, and it's just so beautiful.
Well, you talk about the Greun transfer, the Jerde transfer, which is how they wanted their malls to be experienced, but what about the Lange transfer? What would that be?
You mean in a mall?
In a mall, yeah.
The Lange transfer. Honestly, it would probably be starting to get very picky about what the benches were like and what the plants were like and what the materials and surfaces were like. I mean, the second chapter of the book is about North Park in Dallas, which I think is the most beautiful mall in the US. And that's really the mall with museum finishes and kind of a minimalist mall. And so that's always my standard in terms of how nice you can make the frame for all of these different brands.
Victor Greun is kind of given this, grandfather of the mall moniker. He didn't really want it. He's kind of, pushed it away from that. But he was also very influential on a lot of people, including, I think, James Rouse and even Walt Disney. I mean, Sam Genoway found that, the only book in Walt's archive was The Heart of Our Cities by Victor Greun, which is really interesting when he was thinking about doing Disney World and Epcot. I'm wondering, why he wanted to kind of step away from that moniker. And was it because of suburbia? Was it because of, the autocentricity of it all? Was it because his designs got kind of bastardized by all of these developers?
It's because his original vision didn't take hold. I mean, if you look at Southdale, which was his first indoor mall, which opened in Edina, Minnesota in 1956, his original plans included the mall, yes, but all of this high-rise housing, medical development, office development around the mall. So he essentially visualized, if not transit-oriented development, at least a kind of dense mixed-use city around the mall. And he also envisioned a lot more public facilities as part of the mall, like a true community center. And as his ideas took hold and other developers started building malls, so many of those elements that he had originally had as part of his vision fell away. And the mall became this, big retail box in the middle of a parking lot. And he was really dismayed by how disjointed that made cities, how ugly the malls were from the outside. And so at a certain point, he really didn't want to be associated with them anymore because they had none of the urban qualities that he had been trying to bring from Vienna to the edges of American cities.
Why are we always responding to cars and bad zoning codes?
I guess that's the $1 million question. I mean, one of the revelations for me in writing this book was thinking about the mall as this, object designed to bridge between the highways that the U.S. government was subsidizing and the single family homes that the U.S. government was subsidizing. That, the U.S. went into the post-war era spending money on these two things that were fine in of themselves, but had no provision for community space. And so I think if Greun hadn't invented and popularized the mall, the suburbs would in fact be far more dystopian than they are now. I mean, I think you could write a whole alternate history sci-fi novel about the suburbs without the mall.
That's really interesting. Would it be a zombie movie too, like in the...
Well, the zombies are made by shopping. I mean, that was like, I had a lot of fun doing all of the, pop culture reading, watching, and reporting for this book. And one of the things that was most interesting to me was watching movies like Dawn of the Dead, which is set in a mall, and realizing that the zombies really aren't the bad guys in that movie. I mean, George Romero is commenting on how we are all programmed to shop. So the zombies are merely an exaggeration of what he saw late 70s humans doing anyway.
Your discussion about urbanism is interesting too, and suburbanization as well at the time. I mean, the demand for these malls was driven by housing, like you said. It's amazing how much housing was built in 1950, almost double what we built in 2019, even at a fraction of the population. And so we're not building as much housing now. Does that have any implications for what's happening to the malls as well? Is there a connection there like there was before?
Yeah, well, a lot of the retail experts I talked to said that the US was over mauled. So we have and have had for about 20 years.
Term.
I know, over mauled. We have for, I think, at least 20 years had more suburban retail than we have the people to shop in, essentially, because instead of revamping malls or instead of putting malls in places that didn't have retail opportunities, developers simply built a new mall 10 miles out from the old mall and cannibalized all of the people who were shopping at the old mall. So it's an incredibly wasteful way to get new shoppers and do development. And so what we have now is less housing being built, too much retail, and then that retail is isolated, physically from the people who might want to shop there. So it's just a really terrible development pattern, as we sort of already knew, but the death of malls points it up because you get these kind of holes in the middle of communities where you can just see, oh, here's this empty parking lot. Like, what's happening there? What can we do with it? And you have a lot of municipalities that have ended up buying dead malls back from their developers just so they can keep them secure. Like, they don't have a plan for them yet, but they just want to know that they are locked up tight and that, nothing bad is going to happen to them while they wait for development cycles and the economy to pick up and have ideas of what to do with them.
It's interesting how kind of wasteful we are in that sense. I actually had Michael Newman on last show, who wrote this book, Sustainable Infrastructure for Cities and Society. And one of the things that he kind of laments is that we're so wasteful and we're not very sustainable in terms of how we use our land, and we kind of throw things away as soon as they are used up. And that kind of reminds me of the idea of the mall and the leapfrogging that happens, starting at the center of the city and then moving outward and continuing outward until kind of the cannibalization of the middle sections is complete. That's interesting from that perspective as well, from a sustainability perspective.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that point. And it is an incredibly wasteful way to develop things. One of the points I make towards the end of the book, when I start to talk about ways that people have already started reusing malls, is that if possible, we should be reusing the actual buildings of the mall. They are more adaptable than you might think. And that at least, reuses the embodied energy of the concrete and the steel that's already there, rather than clear cutting them and building something new, like a total replacement. It's much better to try to reuse the architecture, and people have done that. So there's something about the mall, especially with all the brands plastered across it, that makes people think, oh, this can only be a retail environment. But if you strip it down to the bones, the mall is just a series of big boxes, and there are a lot of other things that can be put in those big boxes.
Well, I was entertained by a lot of the things in the book because it reminded me of places I've been and seen. And Highland Mall in Austin was one of them. I went to school at the University of Texas, and then also I grew up in Texas. So for one cross-country state meet where the state's at Georgetown, which is just north of town, we stayed at a hotel just outside of Highland Mall, which you mentioned in the book. And then for our entertainment, while we were waiting to race the next day, we went and wandered around the mall, at Highland Mall. And so thinking about Highland Mall now as a campus of Austin Community College is a little strange, that transformation that's happened. But they are finding ways to reuse the space like that, where they take the building and then they use it for other things. And not just like we mentioned earlier, the libraries and such, but actually places of learning.
Yeah, and I think the Austin Community College Highland campus is one of the best examples of that. It's interesting that you said that you went there, because one of the things that the chancellor of the college told me was that they had saved a giant fiberglass hot dog that used to be in the food court at Highland Mall, and that students would come into the school and see it and say, oh my God, I remember that from the food court, and take selfies, etc. And they're actually pretty respectful of the legacy of the mall. I mean, Highland Mall was one of the first indoor malls in Austin. I think it was built circa 1970. So there are people with, 50-year memories of the mall, and they feel like that is an asset to the college, that people remember what it was and now overlay some of those positive feelings onto the college.
You address the equity as well, the equity implications. And at first, it's the equity implications of everybody leaving downtown and kind of this space that actually had good retail and a lot of department stores and things like that. But then later on, the equity implications of the indoor spaces too. How much did that discussion kind of come into your thinking when you were writing the book?
Well, before I started writing the book, I was already aware of a lot of the new scholarship on the suburbs. First, that, how zoning, redlining, and homeowners associations, kept the suburbs white. And so I wanted to make sure to acknowledge that if you're building a mall in the suburbs in the 1950s, the clientele for that mall would most likely have been white stay-at-home mothers and their children. Like, that was who the target audience was. That was who lived in the catchment zone for the mall. So I wanted to say that, but then as I did more and more research, I just found that there really is a racial component, like, running through the whole history of the mall. And if you're doing history in 2022, you need to talk about that. And it turned up in a lot of different ways. First it was that the original malls were designed for a white clientele, not, kind of de facto. That would be who was shopping there. Then there is the idea that over time, white malls then became Black malls as the demographics of the neighborhoods around them changed, and that often there was a negative inference to that, even though there shouldn't be. There's nothing wrong with a mall serving Black clientele. And then it also turns up in things like mall codes of conduct, which will say things like, you can't have more than 4 kids under 18 going around a mall without an adult. But typically those codes of conduct are enforced on Black and brown teens rather than white teens, more likely to be enforced on boys versus girls, and so on. And so in a lot of places, malls have reinforced racism, even while they have also sold, sneakers and sportswear and all kinds of other things to Black shoppers.
Yeah. It's interesting because, another idea that you've kind of forwarded in the book is the idea of the mall as training wheels for younger kids and for, tweens and young adults as well. And then you have these kind of restrictions that the mall owners wanted to put on kids and tweens and younger adults, like you mentioned. The malls kind of were designed as a place for kind of the white suburban wife, housewife. But they ended up being this place for teenagers and others to gather and meet their friends and be seen and all those things. I'm wondering, that evolution, or was it even an evolution? Was it just always kind of, they didn't really realize what they were actually doing?
No, it was an evolution. And it was an evolution that happened as those children born in the 1950s that would have been little kids going to the mall with their mothers got older. Like, the mall had to grow up with the children of the baby boom. And in a bunch of the kind of mall management handbooks that I read, they had specific sections talking about what you could do with teenagers. Like, a lot of malls had teen councils, or they would have tea parties and fashion shows for teenagers. But that kind of activity is really very parental and very limiting. It's sort of saying, okay, like, you can come to the mall as a teenager if you are a nice young lady who wants to watch a fashion show, but you can't come to the mall if you're part of a mixed group that, wants to hold hands in the food court and like get a little rowdy. That's not what teenagers are like. And that's sort of saying, like, okay, you can only be in the mall on our terms. So the mall owners, I think, swiftly found that they couldn't control teenagers to the extent that they originally imagined. And so they tried to control them with things like the codes of conduct and curfews and things like that. But on the other hand, parents were always dropping their kids off at the mall. As more mothers started working, the malls became babysitters for many people because they have the kind of eyes on the street effect that Jane Jacobs talks about in Greenwich Village, but eyes on the mall, eyes on the atrium, eyes on the food court. So they feel safer to parents than a regular city or suburban street. And they have the kind of walkability and connections that you don't get in other places in the suburbs.
What's interesting to me is that you mentioned San Gimignano a couple times, which is an Italian hill town,
Yes.
and which is interesting to me. And I think a lot of people always wonder, and the answer is varied and long. But I mean, why can't we build San Gimignano here instead of a mall, right? Like, why can't we just build urban places where people want to go or want to be? Part of that's history, part of that's development codes, part of that's fire codes. But like, why don't we just build that instead of making this kind of weird facsimile?
Well, I mean, as somebody who started out as a modern architectural historian, I would say you can't build it without it being a facsimile, because to try to build San Gimignano now is to build a facsimile. And
true.
Honestly, that's what John Jurdy was doing in his first successful project, was Horton Plaza in San Diego, which is an urban open air mall that he basically made look like a Disney version of Siena. So architects of the 1970s were weirdly obsessed with Italian hill towns, and it comes up in their designs for housing, in their designs for malls, in their designs for universities. And I could go on about that for a long time, but it's just like one of those things that once you start looking at architecture of that period, you can't unsee. But I mean, I think that Jurdy did the best version of it because he acknowledged the artificiality of that, but built in some of the kind of wonderful level changes and secret little streets and outdoor cafes and all of that that make San Gimignano so wonderful. I mean, I think the real reason is that architecture in America is almost always driven by capitalism. And so, one of the things I point out is, yes, it would be great if truly public streets had the benches and plants and clean bathrooms, et cetera, of malls, but that's not really the way we build things in the US. So until we improve the public realm, sometimes the best public realm you get is actually in the private space of the mall.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I think that's probably my problem with malls generally, but also the same problem I have with like Apple's Spaceship is that and Johnny Ive's lame opinions too. Like, I feel like, you could have built an actual place there, and then we're stuck with this stuff for 40 to 100 years that you built and is inward facing rather than outward facing, and not very helpful for the greater society overall.
Yeah, no, I have all kinds of problems with the Apple Spaceship. I've written about all the problems that I have with the Apple Spaceship. But what I think is pretty fascinating is that also in Cupertino, there was this old mall that the community fought against the redevelopment of for years and years and years with all the usual NIMBY arguments, but it's finally being redeveloped now as more of a mixed use space with a giant green roof that is supposed to be a public park. And it's still neoliberal space. It's still this kind of neither public nor private, probably going to be policed by invisible security cameras, so only certain kind of people can move around in it. But at least it is providing more housing and more open space for a wider number of people, whereas the Apple Spaceship is simply providing, some trees for the Apple engineers who are locked in their glass house.
And also running into the glass walls.
Yeah. And also driving their cars and parking underneath. So they don't have to look at their cars, but everyone else gets affected by the pollution of their cars.
14,000 parking spaces.
Yeah.
Fun. Another thing that came up while I was reading the book was like, I felt like, and I love trying to make like dumb connections, but like I felt like the mall kind of as an analog to cable television. And the reason why I thought this is because, at one point, cable was where you went to go get your bundle of viewing, right? You got your different channels, you got all the things that you wanted to watch. And now we have Netflix and we have this unbundling. And so I feel like the internet has brought this unbundling, not only to cable television, but also to retail. And so it's an interesting kind of parallel of how those two very different, capitalist mores have transferred, but almost feels very similar.
But the unbundling is super annoying. I mean, I was talking to so I live in Brooklyn and my kids have grown up in Brooklyn. So I was talking to my 11-year-old about the mall because my kids have very rarely been to a mall. They don't get them at all. And I was saying how one of the things that I thought was good about a mall for kids, teens and tweens, was that all of the things that my 11-year-old could do in our neighborhood were all kind of adjacent in one place, and you didn't have to worry about crossing streets between them. And the things that I listed off were basically getting bubble tea, getting a slice of pizza, going into the gift store, and then hanging out in the park. Right? I mean, those are the things that kids do at the mall, but it is, in fact, safer because our streets are not safe enough. And he immediately got it. He was like, oh, it's putting all of those things together in one place. Like the bundling is convenient. And the bundling of cable was convenient because now there are a lot of shows that I don't watch because it's on like the platform that I didn't subscribe to. And I feel like the same thing happens in retail now. There are things that you no longer have access to because they're just too inconvenient.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree that it's not convenient because there's too many different channels now or services, right? And you're right. You can't watch everything you want to watch because it's all on different places. But I guess you'd have to pay for the extra cable channels to do the same, like, HBO and Cinemax and whatever else if you're wanting to watch that bonus movie or anything like that. But at the same time, you're right. I mean, I'm wondering when they're going to rebundle, right? Like there's got to be a point in which they come back together because consumers are going to be fed up with separation.
I think consumers are already starting to be tired of TV. During the pandemic, we had to spend a lot of time socializing online, and most of us were doing less. And so I feel like TV and TV shows came to be a very dominant part of the conversation. And I think when people have more options and are back doing things, out there in the world, they are going to be watching TV shows less. Hopefully it will shrink as part of the conversation. And I don't know if it's going to be sustainable to have all of those different separate networks.
Something just came to me. One of the early shows we did was about Walt Disney and his ideas as a planner. And one of the things that we learned is that, the reason why Disneyland it has all these separate sections in it is because he wanted people to go there and wanted them to experience the park like they would a television. So you change the channel and you go to Pirates of the Caribbean. You change the channel and you're on Main Street. You change the channel and you're on Space Mountain. Those are all different kind of connections between place and between experiences that maybe, we had in these mixed use places like in New York City or even in San Francisco that maybe the suburbs don't have. And it's a fascinating connection. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about it.
Well, Walt Disney was in touch with a lot of different mall makers. He was also in touch with James Rouse, who is the force behind Faneuil Hall and South Street Seaport and Harbor Place in Baltimore, which are definitely, Disney-fied urban environments. And the other connection I would make is actually to John Jurdy and the Mall of America. So the Mall of America has an amusement park in the center of it, which is clearly an homage to theme parks and Disney, but also each of the 4 wings of the Mall of America was set up to look like a different tourist destination. One of the wings was supposed to evoke New Orleans. Another was supposed to evoke European cities like Victor Greun always wanted. So the idea was that you could go to the Mall of America and experience all of these things in one place. So it's absolutely that Disney idea. And the fact that there's so much back and forth between the mall makers and theme parkery is very important. And honestly, in my previous book, The Design of Childhood, I talk about some of the original plans for Epcot that Disney had, but died before they could be executed, which were basically for a car-free or car-light city in the middle of the swamps of Florida.
Yeah, it's too bad his brother just didn't have his vision. It would have been interesting to see, although, Disney had his own problems and issues and stuff like that, but it would have been interesting to see what he came up with.
Also racist.
Yes. Was there anything new that you learned when you were writing the book? I mean, you did a lot of articles, you were able to do a lot of research ahead of time, but when you were writing the book, was there something that popped up that really, got you interested in thinking about the malls as a whole?
I think one of the most interesting threads that I found was the whole legal history of the mall. I was not expecting Thurgood Marshall to turn up in my book on the mall. I mean, I'm a journalist and I have sort of a short attention span. So when I pick a topic for a book, I want it to be something that has a lot of avenues. It's like a branching topic. So, okay, I can talk about movies, I can talk about urbanism, I can talk about the Supreme Court. And that's what happened with the legal history of the mall. So the fact that there was this contested legal history, like, is the mall a public space? Is it a private space? Can you protest at the mall or can you not? Was really interesting to me. And I had a really good time reading through, 20 years of decisions to kind of figure out where people ended up. And where we are today is that whether or not you can protest at a mall is a state by state decision. Different state Supreme Courts have decided it differently. And so if you're planning a protest, you should look up what the policy is in your state. But what was especially interesting to me was Thurgood Marshall wrote the majority decision in the Logan Valley case, which was the first case of a mall before the Supreme Court in 1968. And he said something that I think is still really important today, which was basically that malls have become de facto downtowns. And one of the things that is important for civic protests is to have an audience and have it be disruptive. And so he basically says, if malls have become the new downtown, they have to be open to protest, because otherwise we're leaving people nowhere to go to make a scene. Like, you need that platform in order to make a scene, to make your point, to get attention. And I think that's something that we're still seeing as a problem. And it's still interesting to look at where people protest. There was a Black Lives Matter protest at the Mall of America. The people were arrested because you aren't allowed to protest at the Mall of America. But that was where post, George Floyd, people felt they could get the most attention.
What's the response been to the book so far?
It's been really great. I mean, one of the things that is making me really happy is how many people coming from different angles are, kind of finding themselves in the book. I mean, first of all, I love it when people take my book is an opportunity to write about their mall. This is something I refer to in the introduction, that as I was researching it, every time I told people I was writing about the mall, they would say, oh, let me tell you about my mall. Or they had some fun story from when they were a teenager or from when they worked at the department store or whatever. So I knew that this was an architecture topic that was actually very personal. So that makes me happy. But then the other thing is, I've been working as an architecture and design critic for a long time, but I'm getting requests for interviews from business podcasts, retail podcasts, transportation podcasts. I just got a query. I don't know if it's going to work out, from a food podcast, because I talk a lot about food courts and mall food. So the idea that the mall is actually part of all of these different categories is really fun and exciting. And it's made the interviews much more fun for me, because I kind of never know what questions I'm going to get. I mean, sometimes I'm stretching maybe to the limits of my knowledge, but that is really fun.
Yeah. Well, so the book is called Meet Me by the Fountain, an Inside History of the Mall. Alexandra, where can folks find the book if they want to get a copy?
If you want to get a signed copy, they have them at Greenlight Books in Brooklyn and Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C. But you can buy the book pretty much anywhere online.
We tell folks typically to go to bookshop.org, go to their local bookstore, IndieBound, places where you can find books generally.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely on bookshop.org. And I actually have a mall books reading list on bookshop.org too. You know how they let you make a reading list? So
what's your URL? Do you remember?
I think it's just my name, because I have a reading list for both that and for Design of Childhood. That's basically my bibliography.
So it would be bookshop.org/shop/Alexandra Lange.
I think so. Yeah. But I mean, I'm a recovering academic, so I always have extensive bibliography, and I know other people like to nerd out with bibliography. So I put something together with a lot of books, including a lot of great fiction about the mall that you could read if you're so inspired.
Awesome. Well, Alexandra, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.